Hello, everybody. Welcome to the October 4th meeting of the Gamma Gateway API meeting. This is a community meeting with an open agenda. So please, if you've got a topic, add it to our agenda, and I'll paste the link here in the chat for everyone. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which boils down to be nice to everybody. So with that in mind, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we can start chatting about some of our agenda items. I came with, also please add your name to the attendees list so we can have a record of your attendance and know, who's interested and just, know who to reach out to and get to know the other people in our community. All right, so the agenda is currently occupied by just topics I put on here. You
win.
Hey, I win. I will be trying to delegate some of these out though, because other people have things to say besides just myself. So first topic, Kubecon. It is the month of Kubecon North America, which is crazy, slightly scary, but I am excited to be able to be in Detroit and maybe meet some of you all in person. I think we did this a couple of weeks ago, and plans may have changed or firmed up. But the show of raised hands in Zoom, who's going to be there at in Detroit here in a couple of weeks? Awesome. Looking forward to getting to meet like some of y'all in person. Yeah, even more hands. Nice. I think Contrib Summit is on Monday, and that should be a pretty good place to meet up and chat about things. I'll be busy most of Tuesday at Service Mesh Con, but looking forward to seeing people during the rest of the week and hopefully at Contrib Summit. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else had something they wanted to add about that, but just looking forward to meeting y'all. Go ahead, Rob. I see you on
yeah, so just a small note here. I was chatting with Shane earlier. I think almost everyone on this call is if they're going to be there, is probably going to be at Service Mesh Con. But if you're not, Tuesday is the time I'm just planning on working, chatting about Gateway API, Gamma, whatever. So I'll be around if you want to chat. I think Shane will too. So happy to have a very informal working session for anyone not at Service Mesh Con.
I'm also going to be stuck at Service Mesh Con for most or all of Tuesday, but I'm sorry, I'm going to be delighted for the experience of Service Mesh Con. And I'm not at all concerned about how exhausting it's going to be to do a workshop there or anything like that. Actually, wait, I'm not doing the workshop there. Sorry, I'm doing a different one. Yeah, maybe meeting up after for people who aren't at Contrib Summit would be good.
And also note that I plan on being at every Gateway API focus talk I can be at. I think there's 6 this KubeCon, so we can have an informal Gateway API track going around. Yeah, should be fun.
Do we try to compile those sessions somewhere for folks who also may be interested?
Rob has them on Twitter. There was a tweet thread he did when the schedule was announced. I don't know if there's a link to that somewhere, but I do remember seeing it.
I can link to that, but yeah, I'm happy to throw those in some more permanent place.
Yeah,
I'm
that'd be
not sure
good.
where, but yeah, but you can always, also on Twitter. But if anyone has ideas for where else they could belong, I agree that somewhere handy to reference as we're going through KubeCon would be cool.
There's probably going to be a channel for KubeCon in Slack at some point, isn't there? It might be a decent place. I don't know.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay. So anything else on the KubeCon Contrib Summit? Sounds like we're going to be looking for that list of Gateway API talks to look at and schedule and find time to hang out. If you're not going to be at Service Mesh Con, go find Rob because he will be doing a working session somewhere. So Awesome. Nothing else on that. So move on to the next topic. HTTP route GEP. So Mike has done some awesome work in typing up this beast of a GEP for HTTP routes. It's really cool to see the culmination of a lot of our all the work of this group that we've done over the past couple of months in this GEP. So again, hats off to Mike and everybody else who contributed time and ideas and energy to getting this in the into a spot where we can create a PR for it. As you can see, I've got some notes following, so I haven't finished reviewing it, but please take a look at this and get your reviews in for this HTTP route GEP. This is one of the foundational pieces of Gamma and what we're trying to do. So if you've got nits or anything about the approach, this is the time to get those in. And I called out here in the okay, awesome. Yeah, Max already read my mind. There is a follow-up GEP that is planned to fill in some of the integration pieces around HTTP routes. Mac, I know you're I see you typing. Do you want to add some more flavor to that description as far as a follow-up GEP?
Oh, just for anyone who was on the call last night, this specifically ties into the questions that Rob had about the integration point between North-South Gateway API and East-West stuff, and making sure that we address that sooner rather than later.
And I've got a hearty +1 to taking care of that now, because this absolutely is the time. And then John is working on something for consumer HTTP routes as well. So work streams are starting to separate here, which is an encouraging sign. If you've got questions, reach out to those pushing those efforts forward. Yeah, any questions or comments there?
I'm not sure who owns that doc, but I just sent a request for access.
I also don't know who owns this doc.
I think I do.
Okay. All right, Mike is working on access, and yeah, there's already some good stuff here. I'll make sure to take a look at this as well later. Also, please remember to add your name to the attendees list. I see more than 4 people here, so that's it. Go ahead, Rob. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I just had, I think there's lots to discuss, and I'm in a similar state as you, Keith, of I have a few comments and have not finished my review yet of this GEP. But it's a work in progress. But one thing that I think was a recurring theme in terms of comments was, at least I was confused around stateful set and how that connected here. So maybe just some conversation here would be helpful in filling that in. I don't know who would have more context, but
probably nobody, because that really just came out of an effort that Nick suggested, really trying to clarify and be explicit about what services or what types of service would be support for backends and parent refs. So that was my attempt to kind of go through exhaustively and say, this looks good, that doesn't look good.
Okay, that makes sense. I get it. I'll leave some comments in there and can follow. I don't think Nick's on this call, but I can follow up.
So I have no strong opinion on it. If there's a consensus one way or the other of what we want to do with it, I am very open to any changes there.
Yeah, I mean, my bias right now would be to remove it and not give it any special treatment, but open to other perspectives.
My bias right now is to have as few things in that list as we can get away with to play with. And I mean, a much more serious note there is my understanding is that the experimental track exists to make it possible to quickly iterate and change our minds about things. And so I lean strongly towards, let's be very specific, let's allow a minimal set in, let's play with it, and then let's find out what we need that it doesn't offer and figure out how to deal with that. But I feel like trying to go through and exhaustively add, oh, this and this and this and this and this is just kind of getting ahead of our experience with use cases.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that as well. I think it's probably a better, not experience. I feel like it's more helpful for us to leave it open and then let people go play with it, and then we can say, here's exactly why we support staple sets like this because of
Yeah.
A, B, C implementation did this and found this. So I agree with that approach. Okay, awesome. Then, like I said, please, the GEP is linked here in the agenda. And I zoomed in super far. I'll zoom in a little bit because I realized that, there it goes again. Zoom in a bit because I realized it's probably a little small for y'all. But yeah, take a look at that and add your reviews because now's the time. Last comments before we move on to the next topic. We are speeding through this agenda. Maybe we'll have a gamma meeting that ends early. Ooh, I haven't been a part of one of those before.
Ooh, we should do that.
Okay, yeah. So the last topic that I had was on authorization policy attachment. I missed the last gamma meeting because of a conflict, but glancing through the meeting notes, that seemed to kind of be where a lot of folks felt like it made the most sense to start investing effort. I wanted to see if anybody has done thinking around this or has any reasons why we shouldn't do this, or general thoughts around an attachment authorization policy. Go ahead, Costin.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about authorization policy, but before authorization usually comes authentication. And I think that's something we need to probably discuss because Gateway API also had a discussion with that completely strangely named capabilities for backend or whatever, backend capabilities. And it's been a major pain for Istio, and we made the same mistake basically with the backend capabilities of attaching it to service, and it was a disaster, and hopefully we'll not repeat the same mistake. But realistically, we need to, if we want to discuss our authorization, we probably need to have a stance about how we are going to identify, what is identity of a workload, if we want to depend on SPIFFE or not, or what identity we want to support, and how do we want to represent the SPIFFE certificate son of the server, because that's really what the other proposal needs to address, and all the related issues, and maybe that should go before the authorization.
Yeah, I heard that. Go ahead, Flynn.
Actually, you can go first.
Okay, I want to posit this. I was hoping someone would bring it up, but and save me the trouble of having to. But I'll bring it up now. I want to talk about whether or not this is to what degree this should be in Gamma to begin with. Policy attachment is essentially an interface in Gateway API. It's essentially a format template that a resource needs to follow, and you can write your own resource to handle whatever kind of policies your implementation wants. For mesh, this is authorization policy, like being able to say service A cannot talk to service B, is one of the foundational principles of mesh. And it probably makes sense to create some patterns around doing so. But I worry, as to some stuff Costin talked about earlier, we start talking about certificates and SPIFFE and things like that. How much of that is implementation specific? And I worry that we end up coupling too closely to a particular implementation if we start down that rabbit hole before deciding where that line might be between implementation specific and API that Gamma is seeking to be. Yeah, Flynn, you've got your hand up. Don't know if that was what where you were going or not, but feel free to defer or whatever.
It was related. I guess the way I'd put this is that I kind of feel like auth Z is in some respects easier to define than auth N. And so there are ways I'm more comfortable with talking about auth z and explicitly kind of setting aside the auth n part for now. But on the other hand, your question about, all right, so how much of this should really be in the spec is really interesting. And it makes me kind of wonder, okay, how far could we get just by talking about, here are some common patterns, here are some things that, here are some documentation of examples that we've seen work well in the past. Maybe that's a good way to start with the whole auth sort of thing, right at the first bit.
To prevent myself from talking too much, I'm going to wait to give the rest of my feedback and let others chime in here.
I guess one other thing I'll say about auth z versus auth n is that there are ways I feel like defining authentication starts to become more of a problem when you're talking about multiple meshes rather than just a single mesh, as opposed to, auth z, it's not unreasonable to necessarily have that be an issue with just a single mesh. And I think I stomped on Louis. So Louis, what were you about to say?
Well, I was just going to ask about the pattern side of things. Like, I don't necessarily disagree, Keith. Like, we don't actually have to spec this all the way down to an API. There's an interesting question about what alignment patterns we would want to have. Obviously, authorization policies, leaving aside authentication for the moment, Flynn, I think it's probably reasonable to start with authorization, and then, because authentication is crushingly hard to specify anyway. An implementer of an authorization policy, are we trying to publish guidelines and tell them what they should and should not do, and what they should and should not attach to, and how they should perform attachment, right? And is there any other higher level reasoning that we want to provide guidelines around? In Istio, we attach policies to workloads, and gateways are workloads. We attach policies to those things too.
And in Linkerd, we basically attach policies to workloads.
Right. The patterns for workload attachment are fairly well established in Kubernetes today, right? The standard label selector stuff in network policy, for example, network policy is an example of an authorization policy attached to a workload. The existing network policies only really talk about L3 and L4 stuff. So I don't know if we actually even need any new patterns per se. Rob, do you think there's any advantage in the compositional patterns that were crafted for Gateway API that makes sense in the world of workload selection? Or should we leave well enough alone and just follow the existing idiom?
That's a really good question. I have not thought about that deeply enough to have a good answer. I'll have to get back on that, but I'd like to at least explore it. You're right that there's plenty of prior art here, and we shouldn't try and trounce on that.
One thing that comes to my mind is, Louis, to your point about the existing stuff mostly being L3, L4, it's entirely reasonable in L7 lands to want to have differing policies depending on L7 constructs like, an HTTP path or HTTP headers. So that's a thing to be aware of anyway, and being able to specify those sorts of L7 constructs can be handy.
Does that affect attachment, or is that just a property of the policy?
So following the same pattern.
Let's made that a property of the policy, right? Like, if header is X, do Y, right?
I think you could do it either way. I think the existing HTTP route, how do I want to phrase this one? Right. There are things in the Gateway API right now that give me the impression that they were intended to affect attachment, but I'm not really sure. They're new enough that I could also just be misinterpreting those.
In theory, you could attach an authorization policy to an HTTP route object. I think we might struggle a bit to define the what and why of doing that. When the binding, right, the one thing you have to be very careful with anything that's authorization related is you don't want its binding to context to be ambiguous, right? The more levels of indirection there are between it and the context, the more likely it is that you have a security problem.
So this is
so-
one area. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Louis.
Right. So if we attach authorization policy to route to service,
Mhm.
right, that might cause people some angst in reasoning about the security posture of the system.
So
You
one,
can
this
allow
is
it, it's technically possible, but
Go ahead, Keith.
sorry. I keep misinterpreting when Louis is done talking, and I keep on jumping in. So this is a space where SMI, I think, has some background here, because in SMI, your authorization policy, your traffic target, references a route, and that has caused us some grief, because you're not binding to workloads, you're binding to routes, and when reasoning about your mesh, it's a bit it's complex to it's not intuitive to think, okay, this authorization policy is referring to this particular route, but not the particular workload, and it's very strange.
I think that from the user's perspective, thinking about authorization applying to a route is completely intuitive. And I think that from the user's perspective, thinking in terms of, oh, wait, this policy affects this entire application as opposed to this set of requests that is being made, I think that ends up being strange. Because again, the application developer is going to be thinking in terms of, I am implementing this thing to serve a particular request, and it's dangerous for this request to not be, it's dangerous for some random bozo to be able to make this kind of request. From the developer's perspective, I don't think they care very much about the boundaries between workloads. I think they're going to be thinking of the requests as the first class object.
That has not been my experience, Flynn. But we can politely agree to disagree on that one.
It has definitely been my experience in a couple of cases, but
right. So there are operations, right, that exist that developers, like services call other services and they call operations, right? And there's routing, right, which affects traffic, and then there is authorization, which affects access. But they can exist along different dimensions. Right. So there are many cases when in an authorization policy, you will say, if the operation is this, do this, right? Deny or allow. But there are other classes of authorization policies that don't look at those properties related to routing at all.
Oh, yeah. Agreed.
Right. And so intersecting an authorization policy domain with a traffic management domain causes lifecycle issues or confusion issues. And so what we have seen historically is, yes, you would like operation classification. You would like to know, what the things people are calling and how to identify them and have a kind of consistent ontology for it. But you actually put the policies in different places because they actually have different management life cycles. Right. So like one of the, and this is not a solved problem in Istio by any means, or actually I think it would be a good problem for Gamma to take on, is to actually look at classification of operations as a feature independent of authorization, and possibly even put that in the routing API, right? But it's it would require some thought. I certainly don't feel like I have a fully refined position on it either.
But Louis, I think there is a lot of prior art for authorization. I mean, all servers use authorization, and I mean for gateway. For mesh,
Yeah.
it's network policy is kind of and I completely agree with you that binding to workloads and what network policy is doing, it's the established pattern. But I think gateways should, well, not in this working group, but separately, we need to consider the attachment to routes because, first of all, that's how everyone is doing it, and so users will understand it. And second, because scalability. I mean, if you have a lot of policy, a lot of host names, then it becomes.
Yeah, I agree in gateways. Like we have like protocol specific like mechanisms for granting and denying access to traffic, right? Like circuit breaker like things for serve a 503 if these conditions hold, right? That are pretty tightly coupled to the protocol, and those things that will evolve as part of route, right? Because they're very protocol specific. I'm certainly not saying that those things don't exist at all. They absolutely do.
Can we do this without authentication at all? I mean, do we expect to be able to bypass authentication and just say, hey, your user X is allowed, but we don't know how user X is going to be identified?
Service account seems to be the low-hanging fruit when it comes to, the identity of a service. I mean, you can extend from there, sure, but I mean, that's what's there in Kubernetes.
It's not using network policy, no?
Not using network policy, but I mean, you can set up policies between service, part of service account has an identity within Kubernetes, and you can create rules based on those service accounts. I mean,
I agree with Keith.
Yeah, I mean,
that's definitely the low-hanging fruit.
Right, namespace names, right? You can assume some like, service account at cluster at namespace.cluster.local, right? Is kind of I think the idiom, right? Spiffy codifies that in a particular string format. You could pick one of those. It doesn't matter too much. You treat them as strings. You compare them. If you need, you just make sure your different authentication systems don't produce strings that collide. Right now, you have to things get more complicated with authentication because you may identify more than one principal at a time, right? You could actually have layered principals and other fun stuff like that. Like user and service auth happening at the same time, giving you two principals. So it's not trivial.
But not all of that needs to happen at the level of the mesh either, right?
No, I'm just
yeah. So you can also do things where the mesh takes care of knowing for certain that the workload that's calling you is entitled to do that, and then some other level of software is determining whether the user that is making the request is authorized, right?
Yes, I think in gateways we might run into it a little bit more concretely.
Yeah. A common place where that shows up is definitely something like the ingress is talking to a workload behind the ingress, and a user is authenticated separately. So
yes, that's very common.
Yeah.
I think service account is clearly the baseline, and it's perfectly fine to not specify how it is conveyed. I mean, tokens, MTLS, or other things, right? Yeah. But we need to have a stance and can just start with the basics.
Well, I mean, we may not need to have a stance per se if all we're defining is a pattern for integrating an authorization policy and not actually specifying one. I think the countervailing pressure to that is standardizing an authorization policy for at least a common set of things. Is that viewed as a common good by the community? Right. If you look at network policy is a good example of this, right? Kubernetes has its network policy API. Every CNI vendor implements it. Every CNI vendor also has their own CNI vendor XXX authorization network policy API that does some other stuff right on top. Most users are generally satisfied with what network policy covers, except for the obvious gap that it doesn't cover service account, which Tim and Bowie and everybody else would like to fix. But other than that, right, people tend only to use the vendor ones if they want some esoteric feature.
Yeah, when it comes to patterns, there's definitely stuff we could, like guidelines we can come up with around what to bind your policy to. But at the same time, I'm also to your point, Louis, I'm conscious of not of trying to rush to standardization. You know, Istio has its things, and authorization policy, it might want to fix. SMI has its, you know, I'm sure console, and all the implementations probably have things that like to try to improve about its respective implementation. Is this the right juncture to standardize around things for in Kubernetes? I don't know. I could think of arguments either way. My gut feeling says standardizing like a resource for network policies, probably not where we want to go for this, specifically because at that point we probably need to rope in SIGAuth, and we start running the same conversations that are already happening with reference grant, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but to piggyback on a point Rob made yesterday at the Gateway API call, like that's going to be an ongoing conversation. And I feel like staying away from a common resource at this juncture is probably going to enable more rapid iteration.
So maybe what would just be useful is to write down what we all collectively think are good properties of an authorization system where we all agree. We don't have to enumerate, right, how it's supposed to behave, right? But I think there are some things that we generally agree on, right? Authorization policies have to work for pods and gateways or workloads or whatever definition, like I think we all agree about that. You don't have to use the same API for both, but you should have coverage for both use cases, right? Ingress, east-west, and egress. And you got to be careful with egress because sometimes egress is just east-west by another name. I think we agree we want workload attachment, right? Or if you're not doing workload attachment and you're doing service attachment, then you need to be well aware of the risks that you are presenting and talk about how you're mitigating them, right? Because you don't want the service and workload confusion problem, or you don't want ambiguity. I think we all agree, like you should, the authorization policy should be able to reason about service accounts at a minimum. What other properties do we think we agree on?
Some L7 property, some L7.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Louis, a second ago you were talking about associating policy with workloads and you said something else. Services?
Workloads. And so if you're going to associate a policy with a service as opposed to a workload, right? So let's say you did attachment to the Kubernetes service resource.
Mm-hmm.
The implication of that is if somebody can talk to a pod directly without talking to the service, in air funny quotes, then does that mean they bypass the policy? Or does it just mean that it's an indirection selector for workloads? Right, is service a network path difference, or is it just an indirection of attachment?
I'll throw a wrinkle onto that. What happens when a workload belongs to two services with conflicting policies?
Yeah. Right, yeah, so anytime we have indirection, right, or I think we generally agree, the more layers of indirection there are between the policy and the thing it's supposed to apply to, the greater the risk for confusion. ambiguity, and ambiguity is the enemy of security. So, and then there's Flynn, what you said, right, which is right. There's policy attachment to route, right? And I was maybe arguing that policy is attached to operations.
You want to page up, sorry, page down, Keith, to.
Can we leave with, sorry, Louis, finish up.
So I don't know if we have consensus either way on this one.
I don't know that we have, I don't know that we generally have consensus on any of this stuff, really.
So to step back on service accounts, I think we have consensus. That will be the primary element or a minimum thing that we need to support in policies. That network policy can be used, I think we more or less hope we have some consensus. That we need to extend them to support service account and support our use cases or do something similar with them instead of. And for routes, I agree, we don't have consensus, but maybe it's not become a problem to how to attach to routes because maybe that's something that the gateway should address.
To be clear, Costin, are you saying that network policy should be handled by mesh?
Not necessarily. I'm saying that our policy and network policy should not be completely different. And if you can express something with network policy, I mean, you know, with label XY allowed to talk with label YZ, why not? I mean, it's probably more efficient anyway, and it's already implemented. And we just need some extension to specify, you know, if service account, which hopefully will be addressed in network policy, or if we can find a way to. So basically, we kick in and do our authorization if it cannot be expressed in network policy, and users should not be confused. I mean, hey, I can already do all this stuff with network policy. Now I have to learn a completely different APIs that is completely different just because it has some extra L7 attributes. So I think the focus should be in defining how the L7 attributes will be represented and maybe how the service account should be represented, but not try to reinvent completely the network policy. That's my main point.
Yeah, so I think network policy is an example of a policy that a mesh could implement. Right, it is workload attached, and it reasons about properties of the traffic. You know, mostly focused on labels of the origin or destination of the traffic. So it's a perfectly valid example of a policy, and if it implemented policy on service account, it would be even better. Costin, is the suggestion you're making a little bit more prescriptive that whatever authorization policy a mesh implements, it should not collide with the properties of network policy? That seems a little bit difficult, right? Because you may want to reason about both a pod label and an L7 protocol property at the same time.
Yeah, it's a superset. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so are you then saying it should look like network policy and be structured like network policy to maintain familiarity with that API surface?
Yes, and if you don't have any L7 attribute, you should be able to pick either of them and use them the same way. So if you express just allow access from pod A, or from pod with labels ABC to pod with labels so forth, you should be able to pick either of them and have the same effect. There's no difference if you use one or the other, except performance.
So I want to suggest something. We've talked about a lot of great stuff here around authorization policy, because it makes sense to do kind of what some of us did before Gamma even started, is compile the prior art and take a look at existing policies that exist between different mesh implementations, throw network policy in there, and then pull out those properties that make sense, and then let that guide our patterns around authorization policy.
Yeah, I think it's useful to have a survey for sure.
Yeah, I would tend to think so as well.
Cool. I can start a doc for that. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, include non-mesh as well. That's, okay, gotcha. So Apache, Nginx, etc. Yeah, I think that this is another interesting kind of gamma direction thought I've been thinking about. We've scoped things down considerably to get us moving in a direction and to start trying things out. There needs to be a point, I imagine, where we revisit some of our decisions in light of things that we previously considered out of scope, like multi-cluster or deployment models or things like that. I personally don't feel like that time is now. I think we want to get this in the hands of people, get the HTTP route, let's get implementations experimenting. So that's where I land on that. But if you think that that's awful, please speak. Your message constantly about including non-mesh KH auth-z traffic. I worry a bit with that just because Kubernetes, like auth-z in the Kubernetes domain is kind of what we're aiming for. We explicitly excluded non-KH workloads in our original service mesh and gateway API get. So I would say let's try to limit that scope of the initial survey to mesh and KH network policy and things that exist there. Okay, so API to express auth-z as CRDs, SBAR. That feels right to me. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. Any comments on that direction?
Pretty much all the ingress controllers do have some form of authorization and policies, but
Yeah, I think, I mean,
I
looking
wanna
at
phrase this one.
Nginx,
Yeah, Costin, it's not clear to me that there's enough commonalities between the different ingresses for it to
Yeah, I agree.
necessarily be all that useful to look at the non-Kate stuff. But
what
I
you
mean,
might see, like, do they do route attachment or not?
Yeah.
Like, there's just some properties of them that we could look at, even if they don't have the same necessarily exactly the same structure as mesh things.
yeah, a lot of the ingress controllers express this as, talking to an external thing that just makes a decision for you, as opposed to explicitly describing a policy as a separate thing too, though. So
for gateway use cases, I think it's important. For mesh, probably not, but it's good to know gateway is going to be doing and what, because it's prior art. I mean, it's supposed to, to not repeat the mistakes, try to follow patterns, try to see if they're not necessary to do exactly what they are doing, but to have them, hey, this is what other people are doing. We are doing something different because.
Yeah, I think though Flynn is right, Costin. Like Nginx, like they have CRDs for describing how you do authentication of certain types, but they don't really specify auth-z.
They kind of
as an integration concern or as a kind of intrinsic feature of routing, like if these headers are set, then return a 404, right?
Yeah.
It's probably a little bit, that's already a feature of routing, right?
It's required token, the basic authentication or require whatever and integration.
Right, but they express it in terms of headers, like you enable basic auth and then you say, if the synthetic header auth is set, then, or not set, then return 404 if the path is X, right? So it's definitely part of the routing API.
Everything is part of the routing because they attach things, but Apache, I'm not familiar with Apache, and Apache has special modules that are specific to integration. Anyway, we don't have to include it if you guys don't want it. For mesh, probably
we should do some digging. Like we should look for some good examples. Flynn, you probably know the Ambassador world pretty well. That was an API management product, right? Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, the way the way Emissary does this, Emissary and Ambassador Edge Stack, is that at their level, they don't really differentiate between auth-z and auth-n. They talk to an external service to say, should this particular request be allowed?
Okay,
And
yeah.
yeah. And there's over on the ambassador side, as opposed to the emissary side, there's a little bit more of a descriptive way of doing things that does make some distinction of it, but it's pretty different from what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, other examples like OPA Gatekeeper, right, is a more kind of attribute. It's an attribute-oriented authorization system that people attach, right? It's the thing people attach, right? And then they have a language for the authorization policy. Are there any other good examples? I mean, there are some built-ins in Kubernetes, but they're not super expansive. Like there's webhook, like the webhook's like ability to select over a certain set of operations.
But those
There's
are
some
all,
declarative part of that.
I might be misremembering. Those are Kubernetes operations though, right?
Yeah, no, they're
Yeah,
extremely
okay.
well-defined operations, right?
Yeah.
So it's not the unbounded universe of operations that they're trying to address.
Actually, they do allow arbitrary URLs to be specified, so it is effectively an authorization policy for HTTP requests.
Oh, so it's
Enough.
match path, if path matches, then blah. Right?
Yeah, for the non-resources stuff in HDA server.
Yeah, OPA feels related to this conversation. Like I was thinking, okay, in the realm of Spiffy, Spire plus OPA plus Gatekeeper, where like what's relevant here? I feel like Spiffy Spire is more of trust, no pun intended, the trust domain. Like it's part of that area, which is distinct from authorization policy, and it feels like OPA and external auth specifically is in that conversation. So I can add some that stuff should be added there.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
They're a programmatic language for authorization, right? Like Google's Common Expression Language, which runs inside of Envoy, is another example of a similar, more limited thing.
Kit, you mentioned.
Well, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, you mentioned external authorization. You think it should be in scope? Okay, I agree with that.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think some form of external auth. I know it should eventually be in scope, and I think that how much that we specify implementation should have to have for external auth, that feels kind of excessive specification, but it's important for implementations to have. I don't know. I go back and forth on that.
External auth, I feel, is most useful when people do agree on what the interface, what the API looks like, so that if you don't specify what the API to the external auth service looks like, then you risk locking people in, as opposed to just saying, oh yeah, you can drop in xauth. Here is exactly how it works. Here's what it allows you to do. It is a very interesting thing about xauth that it almost necessarily blurs the line between auth-z and auth-n. I find that that's usually a feature from the user's perspective, but it does make it really, really weird to try to reason about it with those two things as being separate.
I think it's something that we should at least describe at a high level as this is a pattern that some meshes may find useful or may implement, rather than any kind of expectation for conformance or you should implement or support this or anything like that.
Yeah, also external auth is basically a bridge towards existing infrastructure. So I don't think it necessarily needs to have one protocol defined, because that's almost impossible, but it should have a way to specify, hey, AWS or GCP, IAM, and then some URL or some indication of, this workload needs to connect to this particular. Maybe it's not.
See,
Maybe,
I would tend to do that by trying to define the protocol for the mesh to talk to the XAuth service, and then have a reference implementation that talks to AWS IAM, for example.
CPM.
And I agree with that, Flynn, and I also feel like that's one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to try to spec this out, because when you
Well-
talk about different data planes, so Envoy's got one XDOF kind of
Mhm.
protocol, but then Nginx or any other kind of data plane that's going to be making these calls might have a completely different protocol. And that feels like a spot where the gateway API for the ingress use case has been very particular about stopping short of those things that are going to be data plane specific. Rob, correct me if I'm wrong here. But I mean, I struggle. I feel like that's a pretty clear line where Gamma shouldn't be specifying a protocol, because then you're making data plane support that.
I mean,
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Yeah. I think I might need to think a little bit about how to lay some of that out.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
there's quite a
it's-
universe of external things that could
Right.
be integrated with varying interfaces.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things about the XAuth protocols is their ability to serve as bridges between these things too. And, saying, oh yeah, a mesh could in fact go and implement, I don't know, could go and call out to your pet external thing that you wrote all the code for and it's proprietary and all that is one thing. Of course they could do that. We don't get to say anything about the implementation at all. Having a way to say, here is a very broad protocol that you could use to talk to an XAuth server, does provide some utility. Now, that being said, do we necessarily know enough to define that sort of thing? And would it be terribly valuable at this point? I couldn't say on either front. Probably not on either front, right?
That's where I'd land, honestly, personally. But note from Shane in the chat, we are almost at time at 3 till the hour.
Yep.
Any last thoughts before we close this out for today?
So I guess maybe we should gather a kind of, try to describe a set of properties of an authorization policy that we're going to gather in the survey if we're going to farm it out. So maybe we dump some stuff in the doc here and see if it congeals.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
can attach to, like, what the hell can it attach to? What properties can it reason about?
This may be
I don't
another
know
place.
exactly.
This may be another place where it's worthwhile to try to, describe some use cases that we want to try to cope with the way we did back when we were wondering about, well, what is a service anyway?
Yep, agreed. And I've got an action item to create the doc for that. I'll share it
Yep.
really soon. And yeah, we can start collecting things like we did earlier for services and such. So yeah, great conversation. This was good. I'm excited to see where the various different implementations start pointing to where. That's always a fun experience. Okay, yeah, we are here at time. Appreciate everybody attending. The next meeting will be at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. Eastern time. So, goodness gracious, 8 a.m. Pacific time. My brain's all fried. And that'll be next week. One thing that I just thought about in the minute that I've got left, I feel like it's pretty safe to say we're going to be canceling this meeting for Kubecon week. So I'll start making the move to do that. I don't know, Rob, if you're planning to cancel the Gateway API one as well.
Yeah, we'll just call it in person for whoever can make it. But yeah,
There we
if
go.
you need help with any of the process, I can help cancel meetings on calendars and stuff.
Awesome. I'll reach out for that then. Okay, thanks everybody. Talk to
Thank
you all
you.
next week, hopefully. See you.
Yep.